According to
in
many
for what
studies, we are living in the most connected era in human history. But there's something interesting. Some people choose to do the exact opposite. They don't argue. They don't seek revenge. They don't try to explain themselves. They simply disappear. A message goes unanswered. A phone call is ignored. A relationship that once meant everything suddenly ends in silence. And the strange part is, they don't feel guilty. They don't feel lonely. In fact, many of them say they have never felt more at peace. If you've ever cut someone off after being deeply hurt, you've probably asked yourself questions like, why did I do that? Why, once I've been disappointed enough, do I stop trying to fix things? Why can I walk away and never look back? Many people assume this behavior is cold-hearted, selfish, or avoidant. But psychology offers a very different perspective. Sometimes cutting off contact is not a sign of emotional indifference. It is a sign of a nervous system that has become exhausted, a brain that has learned how to protect itself, and a person who has endured far more than anyone else ever realized. But this is what so many people never see. You weren't always the person who chose silence or walked away when you were hurt. There was another version of you, a person who worked hard to protect every important relationship, a person who kept giving others another chance, again and again. You were often the one who sent the first message, the one who started the conversation when things felt distant, the one who apologized first to prevent conflicts from growing larger, even when, deep down, you knew you weren't entirely at fault. You spent a great deal of time listening to other people, trying to understand their struggles, putting their emotions ahead of your own. You overlooked words that hurt your feelings. You overlooked acts of disrespect. And you told yourself that maybe they never meant to hurt you. You believed that everyone makes mistakes. You believed that every relationship goes through difficult seasons. So you stayed. You kept trying. You kept hoping things would change. But over time, something inside you slowly shifted. Not because of one major event, not because of a single painful experience, but because countless small disappointments kept piling up, again and again, until you no longer had the energy to keep showing up the way you once did. Then one day, you saw their name appear on your phone, and for the first time, you didn't want to answer. Not because you were angry, not because you hated them, but simply because you were exhausted. You needed a moment of peace for yourself. And what surprised you was that when you didn't answer that call, the world kept turning. Nothing terrible happened. In fact, the opposite happened. Everything felt lighter, quieter. And it was in that moment that many people realize something important. Sometimes, your own peace deserves to be prioritized over holding on to a relationship at any cost. What's
Thank you for
interesting is
watching
that
and
cutting off contact after being
subscribe.
hurt isn't always an emotional decision. Many times, it's actually a response from the nervous system. When someone repeatedly disappoints you, repeatedly drains your energy, repeatedly makes you feel disrespected, your brain begins to recognize a pattern. This person is not safe. This person causes me pain. This person takes more energy from me than they give back. And after enough time, your nervous system starts doing what it was designed to do. Protect you, not by arguing, not by changing the other person, but by creating distance. That's why many people don't leave after the first time they get hurt. They usually stay much longer. They give more chances. They wait for change. They hope things will get better. But when the brain realizes that the same pain keeps repeating in the same cycle, it begins to shift into protection mode. And at that point, cutting off contact no longer feels like an impulsive decision. It feels more like a switch being flipped. A part of you finally says, enough. Not because you've stopped caring, but because you can no longer sacrifice your own peace in order to maintain a relationship that continues to hurt you. But here's the more important question. Why do some people choose to face the pain while others choose to disappear? For many people, the answer begins very early in life. Maybe you grew up in an environment where love was always mixed with uncertainty. You never knew whether today would be peaceful or tense. You never knew whether people would be warm or cold. You never knew when you would feel loved and when you would end up hurt. So your brain began to learn a very specific lesson. That closeness can sometimes come with risk. That love is not always the same thing as safety. That the people you care about most can sometimes be the ones who hurt you the most. To adapt, you learn to observe. You learn to read the atmosphere. You learn to recognize warning signs long before they became obvious. And most importantly, you learn to leave before things became too painful. As a child, this was a survival strategy. But as an adult, the same pattern often remains. Every time someone disappoints you too many times, every time a relationship starts to awaken old feelings, a part of you quietly whispers, create some distance, not because you're weak, but because your brain once learned that distance was the safest place to heal. This is where so many people get it wrong. They see you walk away and assume you're avoiding the problem. They see you stop replying, stop explaining, stop trying, and they think you gave up too easily. But what they don't see is everything that happened before that moment. They don't see the number of times you forgave, the number of chances you gave, the number of times you tried to repair something that only you seemed to be trying to save. That's why cutting off contact is rarely the first decision. It's the last one. It comes after countless disappointments, countless hurts, and countless times you told yourself that things would eventually be different. Sometimes, walking away doesn't happen because you've stopped caring. It happens because you've realized that love cannot survive without respect. It cannot survive when only one person is trying. And it cannot survive when your peace is constantly being sacrificed. That's why some forms of distance are not created by anger. They are created by exhaustion. And sometimes that distance is exactly what allows a person to begin healing. If you've ever had to cut someone off in order to protect your peace, leave a 5 in the comments below. You don't have to explain anything. Just know that there are many people who understand exactly how that feels. But there's something very important to understand. Not all distance is the same. There is a huge difference between building walls and setting boundaries. Building walls is when you shut everyone out. No one is allowed to get close. No one is allowed into your life because you've come to believe that every relationship will eventually hurt you. Boundaries are different. Boundaries don't remove everyone from your life. They simply help you choose more carefully. You still love. You still connect. You still allow yourself to be open. But you no longer give the same level of access to people who repeatedly hurt you. That's the difference. One is built from fear. The other is built from self-awareness. And this may be the most important question of all. When you cut someone off, are you protecting your peace? Or are you running from pain that has never fully healed? Only you know the answer. But when distance brings relief, peace, and freedom more than guilt, it is often a sign that you are protecting yourself, not running away. This is something very few people realize. People who tend to cut off contact when they are hurt are not always weaker than everyone else. In many cases, they simply recognize patterns sooner. They notice the small things. A promise that keeps being broken. respect that only appears when it's convenient, a relationship that leaves them emotionally drained after every interaction. While other people are still trying to explain it away or make excuses for it, they have already begun to see a repeating pattern. And when a pattern repeats enough times, the brain stops seeing it as an exception. It starts seeing it as a trait. That's why many of these people become very skilled at reading others. Not because they're pessimistic, not because they're suspicious, but because they've spent years observing, years being disappointed, years learning to recognize the difference between words and actions. What other people call being too sensitive is sometimes just the ability to notice signals that most people overlook. And that ability is often the reason they leave sooner than others once they realize a relationship is moving in an unhealthy direction. Society often sees things in a very simple way. If someone spends a lot of time alone, they must be lonely. If someone distances themselves from others, they must be suffering. If someone reduces the number of relationships in their life, something must be wrong. But reality is not always that simple. There is a huge difference between loneliness and peace. Loneliness is wanting connection but being unable to find it. Peace is choosing the kind of space that makes you feel safe. Many people who have been deeply hurt spend years trying to please others, trying to hold on to relationships that are no longer healthy, trying to stay in places that leave them emotionally exhausted. And then, one day, they stop. They begin choosing quiet. They begin choosing people who genuinely respect them. They begin choosing conversations that give them energy instead of taking it away. From the outside, this may look like withdrawal, but from the inside, it often feels like freedom. You are not sitting alone because nobody wants to be with you. You are sitting alone because you finally learned that peace is sometimes more valuable than being accepted by everyone. But there's something worth thinking about. What you're truly looking for is probably not distance, and it's probably not isolation either. If given the choice, most people want safe relationships. They want to feel understood. They want to feel respected. They want to be themselves without constantly having to protect who they are. The problem is that when someone has been hurt too many times, they can begin to confuse closeness with danger. They start to believe that the only way to avoid pain is to keep people far enough away, but deep down, what they truly want is not less connection. It's better connection, less pretending, less disappointment, less sacrifice of their own peace. That's why many people cut off contact, not because they hate people. They simply become exhausted by relationships that make them feel lonely even when they're sitting beside someone. And perhaps the next step is not closing your heart. It's learning how to open it to the right people. Because healing is not about living as though you need no one. Healing is knowing who deserves a place in your life. And perhaps this is the most important thing to understand. Many people spend years wondering if there is something wrong with them. Why do I leave so easily? Why can I cut off contact so quickly once I've been hurt enough? Why can't I keep giving just one more chance? But sometimes the right question isn't, what's wrong with me? It's, what did I go through that taught me to respond this way? Because most people who cut off contact don't do it after the first disappointment. They do it after many disappointments, after being overlooked again and again, after repeatedly trying to hold together a relationship that only one person was fighting to save. That's why walking away rarely begins with coldness. It begins with exhaustion, with the feeling that you've given more than you've received, with the realization that kindness does not mean continuing to suffer. And when you look at it that way, cutting off contact is not always a sign of being broken. Sometimes it's a sign of awakening. The moment you finally realize that your peace matters too, that your energy has value too, and that not everyone who enters your life deserves to stay. Maybe there was never anything wrong with you. Maybe you simply learned a very difficult lesson, that protecting yourself can sometimes be an act of love. If you recognized yourself in many of these experiences, this may be what you need to hear. You are not cold-hearted. You are not emotionally numb. And you are not someone who doesn't need other people. The truth is, you care deeply, probably more deeply than most people ever realized. You gave your time, your patience, your understanding, second chances, and sometimes even your own peace. That's why walking away is not a sign of weakness. More often, it's a sign that you've endured for far too long. People see the distance you create, but they don't see what forced you to create that distance. They see the silence, but they don't see all the times you tried to explain. They see you leaving, but they don't see all the times you tried to stay. And perhaps the most important thing to remember is this: not everyone deserves access to your energy. Not everyone deserves access to the peace that you worked so hard to build. Sometimes, maturity is not about learning how to keep everyone in your life. It's about learning to recognize who should remain in it. If this video made you feel understood, leave an 8 in the comments below. I'd love to know how many people here have chosen peace instead of continuing to endure. And if you'd like to explore more psychology, invisible emotional wounds, and the rare forms of intelligence that can emerge from life experiences, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes, the strongest thing a person can do is not hold on. It's having the courage to let go.